All right, well, hey, apologies for all the IT difficulties getting up and running today, but I think we finally have everything figured out. Anyways, so I'm not all that stressed out about it because I was a little stressed out about not having time to do everything that I wanted to do before our next exam. But maybe first things first here, I'll just go to this today's slides. I kind of made a decision, there's a lot of things going on in the department and all that stuff, so I pushed the exam back until the 28th. You might remember that we were going to try to do it the 21st or the 23rd, but I had 2.5 lectures worth of material that I wanted to get in, and usually when you start to get anxious about trying to cram everything in, it's best to just not try and to take it slow and do that. So I decided to basically give myself 3 more lectures before we hit the review period on the 23rd, and then we'll do our next exam the 28th. That'll work out nicely, and luckily it gives us a little bit of a buffer, so when things like, say, the computer technology isn't cooperating, we're okay, right? We don't have to get too crazy there. So that's my plan. The other sort of aspect of the lecture today is that we've been off for almost a week and a half, really closer to 2 weeks. So I thought it would be kind of nice to sort of ease back into the material that we were talking about before. So we'll back up to some of the lecture 14 stuff. If you remember, we started talking about strategic interaction and things like the oligopoly problem here, right? Where what we were really talking about is games, right, and game theory. And to study these sorts of games, what we mean by games is there's sort of 2 aspects to it. One of which is what you usually think about as a game, right? You think about it as players with rules, and then you sort of take the actions that players make, given the rules, and then you determine payoffs, right? Who wins, who loses, things like that. And that's exactly what we have in mind with game theory. And the simplest possible interesting game that we talked about was this 2x2 game, right? Where there's 2 players and they each have 2 actions, which means that there's 4 different possible outcomes that could occur, right? And then all we did was we ported our usual assumption about how people do things, right? They make rational decisions. Right? We took that and then we said, well, what happens if we take our simple games and we make this rationality interactive, right? And this was a classic oligopoly game, which kind of says it all, right? Or says all kinds of things about how we envision this. And you see we had 2 firms here, ADM and Ajinomoto, so it's typically, I guess you'd say, is a duopoly, right? That's 2 firms in the market. And they have 2 decisions here, which we've picked to encode certain ideas that we're trying to get at. So ADM, for example, can produce either 30 million pounds of, what is the amino acid again? I have to go back again. There it is, the lysine, right? Lysine market. ADM can produce either 30 or 40 million pounds, and Ajinomoto has both of those actions available as well. Right? What we did here was make these actions somewhat coincidental to the idea that ADM and Ajinomoto can behave monopolistically, right? Produce a little bit, or competitively, produce a lot, right? And then our game becomes, if those are the 2 strategies, and the payoffs are kind of set up like this, right? To reflect the idea that if everybody behaves monopolistically, everybody does pretty well, right? That's what happens up here in the upper left corner. 30 million pounds for ADM, 30 million pounds for Ajinomoto. Each company makes $180 million in profit, right? Well, it's also possible that one of the firms will decide to produce 40 million pounds. And in this case, right, we look at this box down here. If Ajinomoto does, as we said before, 30 million pounds, right, behaves monopolistically, and ADM behaves competitively, well, you see that this helps ADM at the expense of Ajinomoto in some ways, right? And that's what's reflected in this 200 versus 150. So it's kind of a good thing if one party is acting with restraint It's a good thing for you if your opponent acts with restraint and you act aggressively, competitively, right? And then, of course, we see over here both firms, if they both behave competitively, i.e. produce a lot, 40 million pounds, 160 and 160, right? Okay, so that's a description of the game, what people can do and what happens. And then what we want to do as economists is say, well, what do we think will happen, right, given people play this game rationally? Now, our tool there was the Nash equilibrium, right, for studying this. And there were some other tools we used as well, right? But the Nash equilibrium was this idea that whatever you're doing, I'm going to play a best response to that, right? And you'll do the same. Whatever I'm doing, you'll play a best response to that, right? And in this way, we can kind of solve this game, by which we mean we can say we think we know what will happen when the players are rational. So as an example, let's suppose you're Ajinomoto, and I'm ADM, and you've selected the strategy, produce a little, 30 million pounds, right? Well, then if we look at my two possible actions, my best response to that, well, let's see. If I produce 30 million, I get 180. That's good. If I produce 40 million, I get 200. That's even better. My best response to your action is to produce 200, or to produce 40 million pounds, putting us down here. We're not done. Right? If I'm going to do this, your best response is then to say, well, let's see. You make 150 from doing 30 million pounds if you're running Ajinomoto. You would get 160 if you produced 40 million pounds. Right? So your best response to my action is to best respond by producing a lot as well. I produce 40, you respond by producing 40. Well, we can check this, and we can say, well, if you're going to produce 40, my options are, well, let's see, produce 40 or produce 30. I'm better off producing 40 as well. My best response is a best response to your best response, right? Best responses to best responses, that's equilibrium. We had some other tools for doing this as well. There's also dominated and dominant strategies, and in this game, you can see that there is, in fact, a dominant strategy. That is to say, if I produce 40 million and I'm ADM, I always do better producing 40 million, I should say, than producing 30. 20 is greater than 180, 160 is greater than 150. So in some sense, I'm optimized, whatever you decide to do, by pursuing that one strategy always. It's a dominant strategy, in fact, for both players. So this, of course, is a prisoner's dilemma game. And the reason it's a dilemma is you'll notice that we both would do better if we were up at 30 million pounds there, right? If we could both agree to act with restraint, put another way, it would be better for everybody. But competition leads us not to. So we're stuck making lower profits. Bad news for us if we're the duopolists here. But hey, good news for consumers, because we're showing that incentives are such that firms would be competitive even when there's a small number of them. So in this particular instance, the prisoner's dilemma, the bad outcome, if you want, for firms, is a good outcome for society. Now, as we move along today, that's not always going to be the case, and we'll see that this prisoner's dilemma is a great model for many things, and hopefully today we'll get to it. Environmental problems would be one situation. So we talked about it last time. You can go back and look at the lecture. We discussed the wonderful movie Thelma and Louise and how it relates to why we call this the prisoner's dilemma. And we discussed a lot of these, general applications. We have disarmament, we have emissions reduction, all kinds of applications of this basic logic, even in biology, right? Okay, so not all games are prisoner's dilemmas, right? And we did a couple of examples last time. We had the dual basketball game, we had the penalty shootout, and we had the stag hunt. Right? Isn't economics great? We have these awesome names for all these games here. And oftentimes if economists are sitting around, the lunch table, this is kind of what you should do when you get on the subway and you say, well, I think this particular thing is a problem. And if you say this to an economist, they'll say, what do you mean, a social problem? And you'll say, yeah. What kind of social problem? What are you talking about? A stag hunt? Coordination game? That's a prisoner's dilemma? That's kind of part of the lingo of economics. So anyways, I thought I would kind of throw another game into there just to, that was my preamble. Now we'll start the real review here, I guess. And I made this very simple game to kind of get you back into the flow of things. And so once we do a little bit of this technique stuff, maybe we'll have a little fun with some of the classic games where we apply the logic of best responses, but we don't kind of have to, hew so closely to the matrix here. Okay, so here we have a startup and an incumbent innovation game, right? And so the idea is to kind of capture this idea that there's a startup that can come into an industry and make a lot of money, right, if they're willing to innovate. And they may put pressure on an incumbent to do so, right? And so, you know what, I'm going to go to the board here. And we'll be, maybe we might not get to all that fun stuff I said about environmental economics. But the good news is we have plenty of time to do that in the over the next 2 lectures. So I'm just going to copy this matrix over again. See if I can do that there. And this will give me a chance to remind you about how all these payoffs work. So we have kind of the incumbent choosing rows, and we have the startup firm choosing columns, right? And the payoffs are 3, 2. This is from innovating, and this is from going traditional. So you might think about this as maybe they're car companies, and the the incumbent, not the startup, incumbent. The incumbent can choose to either be innovative and produce EVs, or go traditional and produce gas-powered vehicles, something like that, right? If you want a nicer backstory. So here's innovate, and here's traditional for the startup, and I've written in the payoffs like this. And so, once again, the incumbent is choosing rows and getting the first payoff, and the startup is choosing columns and getting the second payoff. And so we want to figure out what we expect to have happen in this game. Okay, well, the first thing you could do is you could just kind of, if you have no idea what's going on, this is a great practice in general, right? Whenever you're trying to solve problems in, math or whatever, or life, it's divide and conquer, right? Just start somewhere and, sort of piece together a solution. So let's just suppose that the incumbent kind of produces a traditional, we'll start off by just saying, suppose the incumbent were to opt for traditional technology. Well, let's see here. If they opt for traditional technology, well then what is the startup going to do? What's the best response, put another way, of the startup? Well, if the startup innovates, they get 5. If they go traditional, they get 1. So clearly the startup's best response to this row being chosen is to choose this column. 5 is greater than 1. Well, given the incumbent is going to choose to innovate, what is the best response of the startup? The incumbent. The incumbent is choosing either 3 or 1 then, right? And so the best response of the incumbent is to also integrate, and we wind up with this being the Nash equilibrium. Now you can check this by just sort of saying, all right, if the incumbent were to choose innovate, well, then the startup gets 2 from innovating and 0 from going traditional. So the startup also wants to innovate. So that's our Nash equilibrium, right, of this game. Now, you probably, if you're perceptive here, you might sort of think about this and say, well, I could have solved that by thinking about dominant strategies. And indeed, it looks like the startup has a dominant strategy to be innovative, right? Because 2 is greater than 0, 5 is greater than 1. So one thing, you'll see that even times, I spend a lot of time looking at these matrices, and, I'm not all that clever, but I have spent a lot of time with these things, and I still get mixed up about, payoffs and rows and columns and all that. It takes a little practice getting used to these things. So luckily, I've posted a new problem set on Top Hat for you to kind of do here to think about this. One thing that's kind of interesting, and that will be a nice little prelude for what we're going to do a little bit later in class, is you can kind of imagine what would happen if you changed certain payoffs, right? It's kind of a neat thing to say, well, you know, how sensitive are the outcomes to the payoffs here? And so what if I changed this to 3, right? What if I changed that to 3? Well, now we have kind of an interesting do we have an interesting situation here? So, well, let's think about it here. So now let's think about it this way. So if let's suppose that the incumbent chooses to go traditional here, right? So the incumbent's going to do traditional here. Now, what is then the best response of the startup? Well, the startup is once again going to choose 5 here, and the incumbent is going to choose, let's see, 3 greater than 1. So we wind up here again. What about the startup? If the startup were to choose traditional, well, I don't know why that would happen, but the incumbent and, let's see, IT, now we're choosing 4 or 3. If the startup were to choose traditional, right, then the incumbent chooses traditional as well. I don't know. I guess it's not that, doesn't change things that much. But anyways, you can do that, and we're going to revisit this game a little bit later in the class here. So, all right, let's think about this idea of this best response concept a little more generally. And, you know, it's often a great way to sort of think about problems using the basic logic of game theory, right, without, you know, drawing up a matrix every time and thinking about everything quite so formally, right? And, you know, you can even, you'll see with very simple games, we're going to have some variants on this a little bit later, that you can get quite some pretty deep insights here. So we're going to visit a famous model in economics, and it's a model of locational competition, right? So you've probably heard people say, you know, the old adage, location, 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 right? This is a good model of how that works. And so basically what we do is we assume away everything about the problem except for location. So we say, okay, well, let's suppose, here's my example. We have 2 hot dog stands on the beach. Pick your favorite beach, maybe the Bronx Riviera, right? Orchard Beach. And we'll imagine there's 2 hot dog stands operating there. And they sell identical products at an identical price. The only thing these 2 hot dog stands have to do is choose where on the beach to locate, right? Where along this beach to locate. Well, imagine that customers are evenly distributed across the entire beach, right? So everywhere there's about the same number of people around you. And the catch is that customers, when they want to buy a hot dog, we'll suppose everybody does, what they do is they always go to the closest hot dog stand, right? So you're basically making your decision, you know, on location. And you might sort of in the back of your mind say, well, that's a lot of, you know, very stylized reasoning there, Baker. And I would say, well, oftentimes you do sort of make decisions like that, right, if you're a consumer. The other day I made such a decision when I went to a soccer game on Sunday and I had to get gas. Which gas station did I go to? The one that was closest to me. Right? You know, I didn't even look that carefully at the price. They're always pretty close, which in and of itself is interesting. So anyways, let's draw it up here. There's my beach, right? Oh, and one other thing I might want to, I'll throw out there, is the economist's hat that we put on when we come here in the morning also allows us to think about another question, which is, wherever these hot dog stands wind up, is it the best possible location for society, right? That is to say, if you were you know, a social planner and you were interested in people having as much fun at the beach as possible, where would you put the hot dog stands? That's another little aspect to this. So let me see here. Do I have another? I guess I just have red. Let me see if I have blue here. All right. So how do we start here? let's suppose we have the blue hot dog stand here. And like anything else, it's kind of I don't know if it's a difficult problem, but a good way to start is just to pick an action for one party, right? And then see what the other party does. So maybe blue hot dog stand decides to locate here, right? Fine. So that's good. You know, you can see maybe and maybe red, you know, I'll just throw it here. This seems sensible. Red hot dog stand locates there, right? Fine. Now we can see that what will happen is all of these consumers will go to blue. Remember, consumers always go to the closest. They're evenly along the beach. They always go to the closest hot dog stand. These consumers go to red, right? And somewhere in the middle, there's a person who's like, oh my God, the blue is over there, the red's over there. I'll flip a coin. But everybody to the left of this person will go blue. Everybody to the right of this person will go red, right? So now we see what the firm's demands are for their hot dogs, kind of graphically and spatially, right? And you can also see, you know, if you sort of think about profit as corresponding with how many customers you get, you can sort of see that. So now we can ask the question, is this a Nash equilibrium of the hot dog location game? Another way to put that question is, let's just simplify it and say, all right, well, if blue locates here, what is red's best response? To go closer to blue, right? How close? Very close? As close as possible, right? You've got the idea here. So really what happens is red says, well, if blue's going to be there, my best response is to locate right here. Yes? Well, why is that the case? Well, now look at all the customers that I get. Okay, so there's red's best response to blue's location. What about blue's best response? Is blue's best response to just sit there, given red chose to locate here? No. I see you shaking your head. What's the best response?
Move far away from red.
Move far away from red. I might say in a perfect, I guess they could do that, but then red will just keep pushing up against them. So what might be another, go ahead.
Open another stand on the other side.
Suppose you can't open another stand.
Go to a different beach.
Suppose you can't do that either. Yes?
In that case, lower your prices or add something that red doesn't have.
Okay, you could do that, but we've ruled that out. So I'm just going to give you with our simple game here, right? So what I'm just going to say is blue should just...
Pass a law banning red from up.
How about blue just does this? Says, if you're going to locate there, red, I'll just wheel around to your right, right? And now I get the long side of the beach, and you get the short side of the beach, right? Blue's best response to red. Now, is red playing its best response to blue, given this action? The answer is no, right? What are they going to do? Wheel around to the other side of blue, right? So you can almost picture it. It's almost comical. Where does it all end? It ends with both right in the middle, right? So both firms are kind of stacked up here, right in the middle of the beach. So something like this, right? Where they're splitting the demand from the middle. Now there's a lot we can say about this. One of which is one thing that's sort of interesting about this is that it's actually, if you think about it, not a bad description of what often happens when firms are producing something that's really similar and they have to choose a location. Like if you've ever been driving, through like Kansas or something like that, you go 100 miles without seeing anything, and then there's an exit with 5 fast food restaurants there, right? Everybody's sort of bunched up in the same place. People have also said that, if you don't have to just think about this as a beach or a physical location, you can think about it as a political spectrum, right? And you can take left and right to mean ideologies. And it suggests that if you're trying to win the election, if you think about the voters as the beach, that maybe you want to drift to the middle of the political spectrum to win the election, right? So people, you sort of think about your position being on this line, being your political views, right? And you vote for the closest candidate. Yes?
I'm a bit lost. So, but wouldn't it be more beneficial to move further away from when there's a lack of competition, you don't have to compete.
That's a great observation. So, and I think that's what a lot of people were doing there. So go find a different beach or change your product, right? Those are things you're trying to do to get away from competition. Here we've constrained the gains so you can't, right? And in that case, once again, you would say that, well, I guess it's good in some ways that, you know, these firms are sort of constrained to compete with one another. One other way of saying this is, what if you could collude with your, your counterpart? Maybe you would choose something different. But maybe the most important question for us is this a good outcome for society? And we can say that, well, it doesn't seem like a big deal to people who are at the middle of the beach, but look at how far people towards the end of the beach are walking, right? And in fact, you can show, and I used to do this in my graduate class, you can show that the socially optimal locations are, I guess this would be 2/3, and this would be 1/3 if you're sort of starting from the left and going right. That is to say, you'd want a stand here and a stand here from the perspective of society, and this would minimize the distance that the average person has to walk to get a hot dog. So it's an interesting outcome because people often say this is a minimal product differentiation result, right? That firms wind up competing and producing something that's too similar, right, relative to what we would like from society. So another insight might be, if you think about this as just some product characteristic, like a medication or something, you can kind of in your mind's eye see how it could even describe for you why, say, pharmaceuticals all wind up producing the same, same sorts of drugs. I was going to say something, but I won't. Minimal differentiation. So it's a beautiful little model. And if you're interested in these sorts of problems, and a lot of people seem like it seems like you are, where you want to sort of say, well, what about price? What about different products? There's a huge. This is what we would call industrial organization, which is where we take a deep dive into strategy and firm interactions in economics. So if you like that stuff, that's the kind of course you would find here. And so our very own Lisa George, she teaches a class that's very heavy on the media and tech side of industrial organization. Okay, well, we have another such model that's of a really neat way of thinking about something. And we're going to look at this one a little bit later in class, once we develop the basic idea. So this is the Bertrand model of price competition. But we do it a little bit differently than this price competition we've talked about. So we're going to take, here's standard demand curve, here's price, here's the demand curve. We're going to go, remember that variation of the basic model that we developed, where we just had a flat cost curve, right? So we just imagine that firms' marginal costs are constant. We're going to imagine that there's this very flat, I hope you can see this, cost curve. And I'm going to have two firms, A and B, and we're going to imagine that this is their marginal and average cost curve. So hopefully you're with me on that. It's just flat. Now here's the game. The game is each firm chooses a price, right? They produce exactly the same thing. Right? They produce the exact same type of oil, hay, whatever it is you want to think about it. Sandwiches, I don't know. They're exactly the same. So the only thing they have to do is pick a price for this thing, right? The catch is that when consumers, right, who live along this demand curve, see the price, right, of the two firms A and B here, they go and buy the product from the firm with the lowest price always, right? So, you're selling oil, you're selling gas for $3, you're selling gas for $2.70, I'm going to $2.70, right? Always. And we ask, so if you think about it that way, whenever the prices are different, the firm with the lowest price captures the entire market, right? That's kind of what happens if only price matters. So let's think about red and blue here again. And we'll solve this game in the same way as before. And what we can do is we can just sort of say, well, imagine, right, that this is the price that the blue firm decides to charge. We'll call A the blue firm, right? And we can ask, well, okay, if that's the way we're going to start the game, what is the best response to this price of firm B? Yes?
So just a tad bit lower.
Just a tad bit lower. Oh, Baker, if you're charging $3 for your gas per gallon, I'm going to go to $2.99, and I'll get everybody, right? So this is the price of B. So if you're going to do that to me, what is my best response to you? $2.98, right? Okay, we should keep going this way, right? And maybe by the end of class we'll be done, right? $2.97, $2.96. I'm kidding. Where does it all end, right? Can you sort of see ahead of time where it's all going to end? Well, it can only end with firms charging exactly their costs, right? If I raise my price, I don't get any customers. If I lower my price, I lose money on every unit, right? I'm selling below cost. So you should be able to convince yourself that there's no way out of this when the firms are competing, that they both wind up choosing price equals marginal cost. Now, as economists, we love this because it says that we don't need a lot of, if you're going to sort of think about this as the operational model or picture of the world or the way an industry works, right? It says you don't really need to have any of these, many firms and all those assumptions we made, right? Freedom of entry and exit. If you have two firms that produce something very similar, the result may well be, right, maybe lysine here, that firms could behave just like they would in a competitive market, right? Charging price and marginal cost the same. Now, one of the great things about this is that there's an example of this model, a slight little variation on the theme that really gives you some interesting insights into other aspects of how the world works. I'm trying to find my eraser. I don't know how there it is. And this is the so-called limit pricing model. So, exact same picture. I'm just going to erase this. And this is a good little bit of practice here. Exact same picture. Right? We have a single industry. Uh-oh. That was weird. We have a single industry demand curve like this. But now what we're going to do is we're going to imagine that the firms have different costs, right? So firm B has a lower marginal cost of production than firm A. Blue is more efficient, I guess you could say, than A. Now, we can then repeat the exact same logic as before, but the ending point will be a little bit different. Can anybody tell me what the Nash equilibrium ultimately is in this market? Well, I'll show you what it looks like, and then maybe you should be able to convince yourself that this is how it works. So, firm B charges a price like this, which is just below the costs of firm A, right? So what happens? Firm B basically charges as high a price as they possibly can, subject to keeping firm A out of business, right? So they capture this amount of profits, right, and charge a price just below the costs of the next most efficient firm generally, right? And so firm A produces nothing, firm B satisfies the entire market and makes a profit of this amount. The Nash equilibrium of the differential cost per trend gain. We call this limit pricing, right? This is a phenomenon we call limit pricing, and the idea is what you do is you charge a price just high enough, just low enough so that no one else wants to enter the industry. Now you might think this is cute or trite or whatever, But it turns out this was a major part of Microsoft's defense when it was sued for antitrust in making operating systems, right? So, the government effectively said, hey, Microsoft, what's going on here? You're charging this price, I don't know, $85, $90 for an operating system, and you're satisfying something like 90% at the time of the market. It looks like you're a monopoly. And Microsoft said, well, you know what? It looks like we're a monopoly, but really we're engaging in this limit pricing thing, where we're charging a price just high enough to keep our competitors out of the market, right? And by the way, that price is not all that different from our costs. So Microsoft said, well, this shaded rectangle here is in fact very small, and we're engaging in this limit pricing. So in fact, government, what looks like a monopoly is actually a really competitive environment. It's a pretty clever argument, right? But we're going to revisit this when we talk about later in class entrepreneurship and growth and all that stuff. We'll look at this model again. But these are kind of interesting little twists on the basic idea, right? And maybe what I'm trying to do is emphasize that it's the logic, right? And not so much, the idea that we have to hammer everything into a 2x2 normal form matrix, right? We want the basic idea of best response iteration, if you want to think about it that way, can really get you some interesting places if you are able to describe an interesting and simple game. So, oftentimes, in reality and in theory, games have an order of play, right? And, this is my chance to really, give you some insight into, we use this Nash response, best responses idea to solve games. Well, another thing we often do to solve games is backwards induction, right? So paradoxically, if you're an economist and somebody says, well, I have a game that doesn't look much like yours, Baker. It's a game in which people make decisions sequentially. You decide something and then I do, right? There's a natural order to things. And I say, well, good news. The way you solve that game is you start at the end, backwards induction. And such a solution has a very nice set of attributes in that when you solve a game this way, you find that everybody has every incentive to adhere to every strategy. Everything that they said they were going to do, they do, right? We call that subgame perfection. And I'll show you how this works. It's some highfalutin terms there, but it turns out that they're pretty easy to explain intuitively. Okay, so I have two games here that I've drawn up. One is the classic Monopoly entry game, right? And one is the Punish the Kid game, right? So I'll just kind of give you the backstory. It's always good to have a backstory. So you have an entrant, right, who's maybe thinking about, there's a hot dog stand sitting there on the beach, and that's the old established hot dog stand, and someone's like, you know what, I'd like to kind of get in that hot dog game too, so I'm going to, roll up a stand and sell hot dogs one day. Now, maybe the person who's established on the beach, the existing monopoly, as my nomenclature here goes, says, well, if you do that, I've heard about your plan. If you enter this market, I'm going to engage in a price war, right? That is to say, I'll set the price of hot dogs so low that nobody will make money, right? And then you say, well, that gives me something to think about, right? Should I enter this industry or not? And so on the left, you can kind of see this game where my decision as the entrant is to either go in or stay out, right? If I stay out, I get 1 unit of profit, and the monopolist maintains 5 units of profits. That's how you'd read the thing there, right? Now, if I go in, now you have a decision to make if you're the monopolist. You have to decide whether or not to be aggressive or cooperative, right? So if you're aggressive, neither of us gets anything. That's the 0-0. If you're cooperative, we both get 2, right? So you can kind of see where the tension comes from this game. You'd say, well, if I'm the entrant and, I stay out of the industry, I'll make 1. That's fine. I'll find something else to do with my money. If I go into an aggressive industry, I'll make 0. I don't want to do that, right? But if I go into an industry where we don't kill each other in the hot dog competition business, we'll both do okay, 2 and 2. So what should I do? That's that game. We'll solve it in a second. The second game is you might call it the teenager punishment game, which I've played a little bit of this in my career as a parent. And so you have kind of the S and the, what are the S and the B there? Son and baker. How about that? So my son, I ask him what he's going to, he says, well, I'm going to go out on Friday night. And I say, well, whatever you do, don't go to a party. Go to the movies or something. And he says, oh, yeah, well, if I go to the party, what are you going to do? And I say, well, I'm going to punish you severely. And even though I don't want to, I really don't like doing that. You don't like being punished. I don't like punishing you. That's the plan here, right? And so you can see here the payoffs are as follows. If the son obeys me and doesn't go to the party, he gets 0 in utility, right? And I get 10 units of utility. If he defies me and goes to the party, and I guess I would have to somehow know about this, well, then I have a decision to make. Do I punish him or not? And so in my case, if I punish him, he gets -5 in utility, and I get -1 because I don't want to punish, right? If I don't punish him, he gets 10, and I get 0, right? Because now he's done what he wanted. He went to the party. I'm like a little bit despondent about that, and that's where we're left. Okay, so as economists, once again, we want to take our ideas about rationality to these games. And we suppose that in this case what rationality means is wherever you wind up in the game, you have to be rational from that point going forward. By rational, we mean maximizing your payoffs, right? So the easiest way to do this, it's kind of a divide and conquer idea, is just sort of think about what happens when the game gets to a simple stage here, right? So, for example, in the entry game, here's E. I can stay out or I can stay in. Here's the monopolist. It can be cooperative or aggressive. And we have 0, 0, 2, 2, 1, 5, like this, right? So the entrant payoffs are first. Usually that's the convention. The first movers payoffs are the first ones listed. So entrant payoffs, incumbent payoffs. So the way we would solve this game to make sure the solution is completely rational is we would say, all right, well, what happens if we get to this node? In the lingo, we call this a subgame, right? It's kind of a dumb subgame because there's only 2 things that can happen. Well, the monopolist who's already in the industry now says, well, let's see. If I cooperate, I get 2. If I am aggressive, I get 0. So if the game gets to this point, I will cooperate. That gives us both payoffs of 2, 2, right? Well, now we can go to the entrance decision. The entrant says, well, let's see, if I stay out, I get 1, 5. If I enter, if I'm in, right, I know I'll get 2 because I know the monopolist's incentives will always pull them here. So we would then say that the equilibrium of this game, via backwards induction, is that the entrant enters and the monopolist is cooperative. So that's what will happen. Yes?
What if the entrant doesn't care if they lose? Like, they just want to take the other person out?
Oh,
it's
just malice.
Doesn't the other one have more to lose than the entrant? Because if they both end out at 0, 0, isn't the entrant losing technically?
Okay, so you know what? It's an interesting question, and I'm gonna answer this with my economist hat. I'm gonna say you might quibble with how I set up these payoffs, right? That's an interesting question. You might say, well, if this should be 5, 1, and this should be 2, 0, right? If the entrant's just happy to destroy the monopolist. But you can use the same logic, right? It's interesting your comment didn't argue about my logic. I'll more on that in a second. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, the entrant would bankrupt first. The monopolist can just tank it.
Oh, okay, so...
That's what I was going to suggest before with the hot dog.
All right. So then again, maybe I would say, well, maybe the payoffs here are off. So one thing you could even do, and you know what I would do to capture that? I would say, maybe we're not sure how tough the entrant is. So maybe when the entrant enters and then the incumbent decides to be aggressive or cooperate, maybe then there's some probabilistic possibility here, right? Where with the probability of 1/2 the entrant survives, and probability with 1/2 they fail and you're left, right, when you're aggressive. Something like that. You could build out the game like that. By the way, when you introduce uncertainty, we actually add a third player into the game, nature, right, who behaves randomly, right, or to some payoffs we don't understand or actually model. But once again, I know it's kind of neat that you guys are asking these questions about how all this works, and I'm going to say something about that point in particular. Now, what about the punishment game? Well, we can do the exact same thing here, right? So we have son can obey or defy, right? 0, 10, and then Baker, right, can either punish or not. 10, 0, -5, -1. Well, here you can see that if my son defies me, what I'm going to do is not punish him, because I'd rather have 0 than -1, right? I'm not happy about it, but this is better than that. So my son says, well, I know if I defy my dad, he's a softie. He will not punish me if it comes to that. So he just puts this payoff here, and now we find our equilibrium like this. Defy, and then no punishment. Yes?
In your scenario, when they both end up equally, 2, 2, or 5, 5, let's say the son, the punishment is he loses his privileges to go out if he goes to the party. And then you have 2 options. He obeys, he goes somewhere else,
right.
It's 5, 5.
Sure, once again, maybe you can make a more complex game with different payoffs that gives me a different conclusion. And this is great because you're asking the exact sorts of questions that you should be, because you're kind of thinking about how it works. I have another idea, right, that might change your mind about how all this works. So let me see how I'm doing on time. We're kind of doing okay here. So I would like to, if you sort of think about some of these games that we talked about last time, or we talked about a couple minutes ago, I should say. Here's my startup incumbent game, and maybe the more natural framework, right, where the startup comes into the industry and makes a decision about whether they're going to be innovative or just follow the conventions, be traditional. And then the incumbent, right, sort of reacts to that. So that's what happens over here. Startup goes first, then incumbent reacts. Over here, the incumbent goes first, and the startup reacts, right? And so we can get a little bit more practice with these sequential games and backwards induction by doing solving this. Maybe what I'll do is, we have like 15 minutes left, 10 minutes left. So maybe what I'll do is I'll solve the one on the left, and you can sort of on your own think about whether or not the solution is the same. So, startup, innovate, or be traditional. And then the incumbent has a choice to also innovate or be traditional. So you see how it works. I've kind of labeled a node like this for who's making the decision. It's kind of fun, right? Like to just even draw up the tree. And then 4, 1, 3, 0, 1, 5, 3, 2. So the startup starts, you might even, if you want to make it kind of a little bit more lively here, you could say, well, the startup is thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? How is this going to unfold? Well, let's see. If we go traditional, now, our payoffs are first, right? And the incumbents are second. So the incumbent, if we go traditional, faces a choice between 1 or 0. So if we go traditional, the incumbent is also going to go traditional, right? So what we can do is we can put a 4-1 here, right? That's what we know we know we'll get 4 from going in this direction. If we're innovative, right? Well, let's see. We know that the incumbent has a choice between 5 and 2. We know that if we innovate, the incumbent will go traditional, and that will make this 1-5 for us, right? So, interesting. So if the startup is going first, it says we can either be traditional and outcompete and compete on that basis, or we can be innovative. Well, it turns out that if we try to be innovative, we'll get 1. If we're traditional, we'll get 4, right? So we would say that in this case, the startup is traditional, and then the incumbent is also traditional, and the result is 4-1 as the payoffs, because 4 is greater than 1, and once we get here, 1 is greater than 0. So I kind of, I set this up, right before class, and I'm kind of unsatisfied with that. So I might want to do what you did and sort of say, well, what if we change these payoffs in a more reasonable way? What happens then? Okay. And I'll leave it to you to kind of think about the other one, but I'm going to try to do it in my head here. So let's see, if the incumbent goes first, well, I should have switched the payoffs, so that one doesn't make sense. We'll leave it at that. So one thing I will say is that these games can be pretty complex, and you can put all kinds of things in here. So here we have one example of what is called a chain store game, which is where an entrant decides whether or not to enter an industry, and then a chain store has to decide whether or not to acquiesce or fight. Once the chain store decides whether or not to do that, a second entrant observes what happens and then decides whether or not to enter, right? So you have 3 players making decisions here, and then entrant down here you say, okay, if the entrant stays out, then the next person has to decide to stay out, and the chain store has to decide to fight there. That's a little much for this time of class, but you can see the idea is, you can make these trees almost as long as you want, but we would always start it in the same way, by just looking at the very end of the game. What happens in these circumstances? What happens in those, as we move back up the tree, and then we can solve the game. It turns out always, right, when you do things sequentially and use backwards induction. That is called Zermelo's theorem, right? Every finite game with payoffs that are different at the end has a unique solution. This one, by the way, is designed to get at this logic, which I think some of you were mentioning, right? This idea that, well, what you want to do is you want to prove that you're tough. So you want to fight the first entrant so the second one stays out. It's kind of the idea here. The centipede game is another classic, right, where you can sort of it's one of these games where you can keep playing or terminate, and the payoffs are down here, and the question is, well, what will happen in the end here? And I'll leave those for you to think about. I'm never going to ask you questions about that, but it just shows you a little bit about the possibilities. So I hurried a little bit there. We're in pretty good shape here. You might be surprised to know that there's a lot of experimental evidence out there in how people actually play these simple games, people like yourselves, right? In fact, students are very often the lab rats in these games, right? Where we get a bunch of students together, we say if you play the game this way, you can earn some money, if you win the game, and we pair people off and have you play. And this has led us to this thing called behavioral game theory, a fantastic field. We've had some MA students write awesome papers in some of these games. And one of the interesting things that happens is people often play in a way that we wouldn't think, right? In a way contrary, I should say, to the predictions of theory, right? So the classic game for this is the so-called ultimatum game, right? The ultimatum game is a sequential game where what I do is, suppose we have $100. I have $100, right? Or it's sitting there on the, how about we make it 1,000? we'll say $1,000 is sitting right here on a table, right? And you and I can have it, right? The only catch is what I have to do, or what we have to do, is split it in a particular way. In fact, what I do is I propose a split of the money, and then you either accept it or reject it. If you accept my split, right, then we just keep the split goes, and we just keep the money according to the split. If you reject it, nobody gets anything, right? The money, someone sets the money on fire. Okay, so let's think about this strategically, and we can do it via backwards induction. And the way you might do this is you would say, all right, well, let's see, I'm making a split here. I'm choosing, how much you get. If you're rational, you should accept any amount that I offer you, right? Because anything is better than nothing, right? Destruction, you get 0. If I give you a positive amount of that money, you get something. So maybe the smallest split I can do is offer you $1 from the 1,000, and that would be my split, right? You get $1, I get $999. Now you can either accept it or reject it, right? So theory would suggest that that's the Nash equilibrium, right? I propose a maximal share for myself, a positive share for you, and then you accept it and we're done. But it turns out people don't play the game that way. Are you shocked? What often happens is if I suggest splits like that, you reject them and no one gets anything, right? And so usually the proposer anticipates this and is prone to do 50-50 stuff, right? Like I'll suggest I get 500, you get 500, or maybe I go 550 and you get 450. In which case you're probably like, that's a little, it's not great, Baker. What if I go 700 and 300? Would you take that? $300 for you, 700 for me? 800 for me, 200 for you? No? So some people are saying no, they wouldn't do that. Right, and this is one of the interesting things, is that people have this built-in, we think, this built-in idea about fairness, right, and being treated fairly. And so that's one way in which they depart from our ideas about rationality, right, strict rationality. Another game like this is an investment game. I give you some money, you invest it, maybe it's a risky investment, it succeeds or it doesn't, I don't know, and then you can give some money back to me, right? But you could always just say, oh, I'm sorry it didn't work out, and give me nothing. Now, economic theory would suggest that you would always say that, right? Whatever happened. You would say, well, I can either keep all of my money or give some of it back to Baker. I'll just keep it all, right? If he gives me anything, whether or not my investment's successful. Then I say, well, knowing that you're going to do that, I'm not going to give you anything. So there's the Nash equilibrium. I give you nothing, you give me nothing back. That's the theory. In reality, what often happens is I give you something and you invest it and then you pay me back, right? If it works out. So people also have this built-in, I guess I can cut to the chase here, this built-in idea about, sort of being ethical and stuff like that in certain circumstances. So anomalies. Yeah, go ahead.
What about when there's interest? Like I give you something, but you have to give me like this percentage.
That would kind of fall into the general scheme, right? I could say whatever it is you make, give me 1/3 of it, and I'll be satisfied. And you could say, oh, I lost it all, sorry. Didn't work out, my restaurant went under. And just keep it all for yourself. So it's kind of the same idea, but yeah, go ahead.
Hedging is kind of what we do for stockholder equity in accounting.
Right, that's a good leading application, like venture capital and things like that. Now, yeah, so that's maybe the leading application of what we're trying to get at. And I think that's kind of what happens is a lot of times, especially if you go way back in ancient history, a lot of things sort of worked this way. Like you would invest in a voyage that would take years, and who knows what the hell happened to your money. But at the end of the day, people often wound up paying back, even when they don't have to. So one other thing, quickly, 30 seconds. There's this enormous literature on uncertainty in repeated games. That is to say, how often we will play them. and these games that you play an infinite number of times effectively, right? Games that never end. So you might, for example, argue that my game with my son, the punishment game, well, one of the things about it, it isn't that we just do it once, right? We do it over and over and over again. And we're not sure how, I mean, he's getting ready to go to college and all that stuff, but we're not sure how many times we're going to have to play these games. And why does that matter? Well, if you don't know where the end is, you can't backwards induct, right? And it turns out that changes everything about these games. So, you know, things like reputation, punishment in the short term, all of these things sort of become important. But you'll notice that just by kind of thinking about this rigid game that evolves according to these steps, we sort of get that insight too. So we'll pick it up next time. We talked a lot about all of this stuff. We don't really have time for anything else. And we'll also bring some of this to bear, in addition to our old friends supply and demand, on environmental economics, right? Sure, I'll see you then, Thursday.